Hi, welcome everybody to Kingsfield's, I don't know how many this is now. We're doing a whole series of webinars around the impacts of COVID on your projects, starting with some looking at very practical problems around force majeure, and now moving into some other areas that we think might be of interest to you. So we're going to have about 45 minutes today, which is the sort of usual time for our webinars. I'm joined by Gabrielle Burien, who is the managing partner from Kingsfield, and I'm sure many people on the call will already know her. And also Hello. Mark. Hi, sorry, Gabrielle. And also Mark Emden of Nexi Consulting and ex-Shell. So bringing a lot of experience to bear, and one of our sort of partner organisations with Kingsfield. So we're very much looking forward to hearing what Mark's got to say as well. So the focus of today's webinar is acknowledging really now that many of the projects that you're working on have probably moved from the kind of crisis management phase when this first hits as to what on earth we're going to do, starting to understand and think about the short to medium term impacts of these. And I would imagine, and I know from talking to many of our clients, there's an overwhelming number of conversations and decisions that need to be made. So some projects have continued operating throughout this crisis. You've got to question as to how productive and the disruption that's sort of been going on there. Other projects have been suspended, and there would be a need to understand where the project was at the time of suspension, and were you already in some concurrent delays, etc. And we've talked about some of these issues before. And other projects that haven't even started or are going to restart, maybe on a completely new basis, because maybe the business case has changed, or there's an opportunity here to actually make something out of this, crisis. So there's many conversations, I think, that will be had, need to happen, and are probably already ongoing. But also the real hard facts of the impacts of cost, schedule, potential, massive changes in the way that you're executing your projects. And our assumption and our ethos, I suppose, within Kingsfield is that we believe that should be done in as largely collaborative manner as possible. I don't think any of us want to end up in dispute over this situation, and almost every professional body that you will see in the industry at the moment, both in the UK and in Europe, are advocating that this is resolved collaboratively. So we're not going to be talking here today about the physical process of rebaselining or restarting your projects, but more about the manner and the behaviour and the leadership qualities and strategies that you might want to employ in having those conversations. So that's my kind of introduction, and I'm going to pass over to Gabrielle now to sort of tee up this discussion, and then we're also going to obviously bring Mark into this conversation as well.
Right. Thanks, Karen, for the introduction. So I think what's concerning us in Kingsfield is what we've been seeing, as in those previous webinars, which were focusing a lot on force majeure issues as a result of the pandemic. And people on projects don't set out to end up in dispute, but they frequently do. And so in our experience, any kind of type of disruption that threaten project goals can give rise to, firstly, conflict. And if that conflict remains unresolved, then it might end up in legal dispute. And that's obviously not a great position to be in. And the pandemic, is clearly on not all projects probably, but on some projects, we're certainly seeing that already. It is a disruption that is causing conflict already. So I thought it would be useful to explore why is, what's happening there actually. What is, when things go wrong, why do we so often end up in conflict and later in legal disputes? And because if we know why, then we can do something about it, and that's what I would like to explore with you.
Okay, so what we're going to do is put up a quick poll. We've got a few of these to seek your feedback sort of through this 45 minutes, and we've got Wayne helping us in the background. So I wondered if you could put the first poll up, Wayne, which is about when events threaten to derail project goals, as Gabrielle's talking about. What's the default position? Are project parties more likely to pull together, blame each other, or carry on? And if you would like to just select one of those, then we can start to see what your kind of feeling your default position is. That. So maybe I'll pass back to you, Gabrielle, whilst we wait for the wait for those results to come up. And Wayne, if you put them up as soon as they're ready, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So there's imperfect grammar in that sentence. Yeah, when an event threatens. Oh, here we go. So we got the results. So the majority of you think people will pull together to help each other out. So good on you that is happening when there is a crisis on a project. But still, a significant portion of you think, 42%, that blaming each other for perceived wrongdoings is also a pretty strong response. Okay, so let me share some research by a guy called Martin Loosmoor, academic, professor of construction management, a professor of technology in Australia. And he actually did some research into construction crisis. He was interested in project organizations. How do they deal with a crisis? And he defined a construction crisis as an event that threatens high priority project goals and demand a kind of time pressured response. I'm sure many of you will recognize that kind of crisis, because that's just what happens on construction projects. And he identified that in those crises, they seem to have an inbuilt mechanism that create conditions which make the management more difficult. So that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? If there's a crisis and then our default responses actually create conditions that make the management difficult. So he called that the three ironies. We've got a slide for that Wayne is going to put up. He called it the three crises, the three ironies of crisis management on construction projects. And they are, so at a time when collective responsibility and teamwork are important, they are less likely. At the time when effective communication is important, it is less likely. And at a time when mutual sensitivity between project members is important, it is less likely. So I thought for an academic, that's quite a poetic way of putting things. So at the very time when we need cooperation, when we need to show understanding, and when we need to communicate effectively, our default responses seem to make those good productive behaviors less likely. And I think with the pandemic, on some projects, that is also behaviors that are kicking in and we are seeing. So, and if they are unresolved, then that's the stuff of legal disputes, right? When things are unresolved. So if this is how it works, right? If our default and defensive behaviors, and maybe it's fair to say poor leadership, right? But it's all human. If that's what happens in crisis, then we do have a bit of a problem. It sounds all a bit negative, which is why I'm handing over to Mark, because Mark, you have worked I've described the problem, right? You've worked with and across project teams to also help build their capacity for working together, right? So I don't know whether those three ironies chime with you, but how can kind of cooperative and collaborative behaviors, how can they help overcome some of this?
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thanks, Karen. And it's great to be able to join this webinar. One thing I'd say is for those who are also dialing in, if you've got questions that you have as we're talking, do remember to put those into the chat, and we'll attempt to address those towards the end of the call. So do get involved. I just want to touch on the response to the survey, where 52% of people said that we pull together in a crisis. And there's a lot of research that shows in that initial moment of a crisis, we do pull together. And we've seen that in so many instances. So whether it's natural disaster, whether it's what's happened with COVID, at that initial moment of a crisis, there's a social reaction, almost a social need to support each other. But over time, that starts to wane away. And again, we see that in the news, that where everybody was pulling together, we're in this together, we've moved to a world which is more about, well, hang on, I don't want to be in lockdown anymore. I don't want to be wearing a mask. So it is a bit of a natural reaction. And if I think about those three ironies that you talked about, in a way, our primitive human brains are programmed when faced with threat to either fight, flight, or freeze. Now, neither of those is actually about collaborating and helping, but it's more a protective mechanism. So I'm not surprised by the ironies, and there's a bit of a natural reaction to that. If, as you said, I've worked on my previous career when I was working in Shell, worked on many capital projects, and a lot of the time spent trying to get owners' organizations and the various partners to collaborate, to work together. And we all know that projects are not smooth sailing, they all have hiccups. And at this particular moment in time, it's probably a good moment to be thinking about re-establishing working relationships. So I know in the previous webinars you talked about rebaselining, the importance of looking at project plans again, cost and schedule. But how often do we also take time out to look at renorming the ways of working? Especially if we consider that the context has changed. So even if you did that at the start of your project, we're now operating in a different context. There's different pressures, there's different drivers, potentially there's now different people working on the project. You may actually have different partners for whatever reason. And all of these things are triggers to actually go back and revisit, how are we going to work, how are we going to collaborate, how are we going to behave? And so it would be actually interesting to get a sense of how many people even do that at the start of their project. So Wayne, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the next poll, where I'm really curious around how often people spend time at the start of their projects focusing on alignment around ways of working. So I'll give you a few moments to put in a response. Now, I ran many of these workshops during my time, and to be honest, learned some lessons, made some mistakes. Some were more successful than others, and sometimes run ways of working, and that's not surprising. Good to see that it's only a small percentage said, you mean there's more to a project, that we actually need to talk about this stuff? Very much so. So good to see that it is being done, but it really should be done at the start of all projects. And then I think we've got a second question, which looks at, okay, it's great if you're doing that, But do you only do it at the start of the project, or is this something that you revisit during the life of a project? So again, it would be curious to see what people, how they react to that. You know, I liken this a little bit to your Premier League football team. If you have the workshop at the start of the project, it's a bit like your pre-season training. And then if you do no more training during the rest of the year around how you work together or how you're going to play together, how can you expect to get really good performance, strong teamwork, effective collaboration? It's something you need to be revisiting and working on during the life of either the football season or even the life of the project. So what do the results tell us? Only when something goes wrong, and that is a trend that you know, as I said, I've been guilty in the past. Run the workshops, come up with some nice statements. They end up with posters on the wall, and then they're not really revisited again. So, you know, we all know that you know, effective collaboration between the various project partners can save costs. It can have a positive impact on schedule, certainly on safety. And we also know that by achieving positive results, that makes us feel good on projects, and it also then in turn builds commitment to help when things do start to go wrong down the track. So very strong need to be looking at collaboration across projects.
Mm-hmm. So Mark, I mean, we use this term collaboration a lot, and I think it's used fairly to cover a multitude of different issues. So what do you really mean when you're thinking about collaboration, and are there some other models that kind of are relevant to that would be helpful to understand from your perspective?
Yeah, Karen, great question. Because you know, so often we've all heard it that senior leaders say, I want collaboration across. I want everyone to collaborate. I want strong collaboration across my project, and that does come from a good place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's coming from positive intent. So I think that's really important. But what I'd like to suggest is there's probably three things that we need to look at: coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. Mm-hmm. So if you'll allow me just to spend a little bit of time on each one. If you think about coordination, that's very much about information sharing. It's about the updates, it's about project performance, it's how are we tracking against tasks. It's the traditional stuff that you would expect to see in your project coordination team meeting. So I think we're all very, very familiar with that.
Mark, you might want to. We're getting your audio stilting a bit.
Cooperation is when we start getting more into the back. If I turn off my camera, that might. Or how's the audio
I would
now?
suggest. I would suggest turning off your camera. We can still hear you. We've all seen you now, so so maybe that would help with your bandwidth. That's perfect. Thanks.
All right. Okay, let's see how this, just let me know how this goes. So cooperation is more around behaviors, and that is where, there's the exchange of information, but I'm doing something in support of another person's goal. And that's, you know, in simple language, that's about being helpful to each other. And that is something that we want to see across our projects, that sense of cooperation. Collaboration is has a higher degree of interdependency, and it's where we're creating knowledge through focused work. So it's when we're coming together with intent, and there's we have joint tasks that we put ahead of anything else. And that last bit's quite important. So we're putting our own drivers second to that of the joined up drivers of the project. And in a way, it's characterized by, you know, me giving up control of something for the greater good, and in this instance, the greater good being the project. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about it, you don't want everybody collaborating on everything. If you just, from what I've said, how much time and effort that would take. So you want to be very intentional. Where are the moments of collaboration? Who needs to collaborate with whom? And I liken this move from coordination, cooperation, collaboration to a progression from me to we to us. Mm-hmm. So, Gabrielle, hopefully that gives a little bit of insight into, you know, as you said, you presented the problem, and there's probably 3 layers to the solution. Really clear on where coordination needs to happen, behaviors around cooperation, what that looks like, how leaders need to role model that, the degrees of freedom you give your teams to cooperate, and then finally getting very intentional about cooperation. Who needs to cooperate and where that should happen in your project.
Yeah, so I really like those, you know, helping us with those distinctions between those 3 different types of let's call it cooperative behaviors. And I think it is important. We may use it colloquially, interchangeably at the moment, but it's also important to understand the difference. What I want to pick up on is when you said true collaboration puts the joint task ahead of everything else, right? For me, that's a kind of mind over matter approach that is absolutely essential, especially in a crisis, right? Not only, but especially. And I am, maybe I'm a glass half full person, I don't know, because I'm going to return to the problem that I'm seeing often, you know, too often on projects, and have seen for, you know, the whole of my career in engineering construction. That our default behaviors often seem to work against us, right? And collaboration and cooperative behaviors does feel like the right approach to create the kind of collective responsibility that Lusma was talking about, and teamwork, or, you know, cooperation between the parties. But how do you achieve that? And we do know that one barrier that exists are existing contracts, right? So those of you who are on projects at the moment, right, more than likely, more than likely you will probably work under what we call a conventional contract, where risk is not shared between the parties, say between the owner, the contractor, the first tier contractors, and therefore that kind of procurement model does drive adversarial behaviors, right? And but there are alternatives, right, which Karen is going to come back to later around collaboration, collaborative procurement models. What happens when a crisis hits, you know, the kind of crisis we're talking about, where project goals are really threatened, time is pressuring people into making decisions, is that people withdraw to self-interest and really look after their own interests, their own issues, and the idea of collaboration goes out of the window. Even so, 52% of you said, you know, we pull together in a crisis. Well, very often we're seeing a different kind of behavior, and it makes sense, doesn't it? If you've taken on a lot of risk, your organization, in a contract, on a project, then that financial exposure that you might suffer when there is time overrun, cost overrun, that financial exposure makes people feel very, very vulnerable. And what we've seen with the pandemic and those webinars that Karen has been involved in, I think people are very quickly to go to the contract and kind of play the force majeure card to see, you know, what benefits they can get out of this, right? And the thought of how do we pull together, how do we restart the project, sort of goes out of the window. But yet true collaboration puts the joint task ahead of everything else. We heard. So the question is for me, how do we help people take collective responsibility and look at their respective interests, right? Which is, instead of taking positions, how do you explore your interests, the other parties' interests, and explore the common ground that exists because of the interdependencies. So the interdependencies mean you have a common interest. Often that's project completion, right? So, Mark, I think you've got some further insights that kind of relate to that, what I've just said.
Yeah, and again, if the audio goes, let me know and I'll stop the camera. So collaboration can take place at a number of levels, and it sounds strange. I said you don't want it all the way across your project, but I've just said it happens at different levels. And the two do fit together, because you just want to be very intentional around where that collaboration takes place. And to your point, Gabrielle, it is driven by shared purpose. Ruth Wagaman, who is a professor at Harvard, she does a lot of research around teams, team performance, collaboration, and how we need to collaborate in order to solve the world's wicked problems. And if you apply that to the challenges of projects, it is really about stakeholders working together so that we enhance the conditions that will result in better outcomes. So if you think about that, you're right. It's not about you can't achieve that if I hold my position and you hold your position and that's it. It really does need to be about shared intent, shared purpose. And at the most senior level of a project, across all the partners, across all the stakeholders, how do we work together? How do we demonstrate the leadership and the role modeling that ensures we're creating the conditions, because conditions start at the top, that result in better outcomes? So that's the first thing. And a lot of that is also about stepping back and saying, acknowledging the vulnerability, which contracts and vulnerability don't generally go together.
No.
But I'm more a behavioral person than a contracts person. But I do believe that you get out of this through working together, having that common interest, that common purpose, and that innate belief that we're all coming to the project for the same reason, and that is to achieve a positive outcome, not to deliver against a contract per se, but to be quality engineers, to be quality project folks. And I think that's a strong driver. So it is about having conversations around purpose, and you can have those at different levels within your project. And if you think about it, you can have a
Yeah, sorry, Mark. I just relating to that, I had
Sure.
a question from one of our delegates, Carl, who's saying that from his experience that contractors are often quite open for collaboration, but when clients talk about it, and you can certainly maybe shed some light on this, having come from a client organization, is that what most of them actually mean is that contractor has to do what they want them to do. And that's the common perception, which is another reason why it's really valuable to have your insight on this call as well, coming from a client organization. So what do you think about that in this context?
Yeah. If your owner or client organization has that mindset, it's actually, I believe, it's setting the project up for challenge. And one of the things we did in Shell was to look at how did we need to change our attitudes, our behaviors, our relationship with partners in order to make projects more successful. And there are a number of project benchmarks, whether it's IPA or others, who, when they look into, one of the key areas that they look into is the effectiveness and the working relationships across the project.
Yeah.
And they give it a number, and they can see how that impacts your project results. So if as an owner you have this mindset of, I'm going to push all that onto the contractors, you're really not doing yourself a service.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've got another question, but I'll hold that for a more appropriate slot. So thanks.
Sure.
Where did we get to?
So yes, where did we get to? Yeah. So I think
we've got about 10 minutes. We've got about 10 minutes or so
Sure.
to go with our general discussion, just for your information.
So we've talked about collaboration being wonderful. And the one thing I do just want to re-emphasize is that you can have too much collaboration. It takes up time. It takes effort. If people are bouncing around from meeting to meeting or subcommittee to subcommittee, when are they actually doing the work? So that comes as a cost. And there's a great, if you haven't read it, there's a great book by Jake Braden called Tipping Sacred Cows. And one of the things he talks about is that organizations sometimes have a desire for automatic collaboration. And what he means by that is it becomes the norm. People feel, I have to collaborate. It's what I get rewarded for. And what isn't looked at is the cost of that collaboration. And he goes on to say that it is easy to hide accountability when everybody's collaborating on everything, because it's very difficult to answer the question, who's then accountable for the actual delivery of X?
Yeah, oh, that's a fair point, and I see that quite a lot on projects. And it's a way of absolving people from responsibilities of. And I say at the moment, I would imagine that there is a ton of very difficult decisions that need to be made, some of which could and should be done by individuals, and then others, as you say, it's not about collaborating on absolutely everything, because the project will just get stuck. Yeah. Okay, so Gabrielle, to sort of coming back to the pandemic, and we want to be away from disputes, hopefully. And I've got a question here from Vikas on the panel, which sort of fits here, which is saying, the collaboration will only happen if there's mutual trust in between, built between the parties, and if the contract limits this, and the legal bindings sort of need to be removed in order to do that, because how do you have an open conversation, maybe a without prejudice conversation, etc. So this issue of mutual trust, where do you think that fits in?
Yeah, because you're so right, because without trust, between the parties, really there's nowhere to go, and disaster lies definitely down the road. The problem is the contracting position, and maybe people's attitudes. There are unenlightened owners, and there are unsophisticated contractors, definitely. The current is against you. So what we really need is for people to, we don't have a silver bullet here, right? There's no magic formula, and it's extraordinarily difficult. We're all humans, but it's also not rocket science. Irrespective of whether you're from the contractor and from the owner, the first step towards building trust is to kind of show courage and ownership, right? And own issues, and start the dialogue. It doesn't matter where you are in the supply chain, you can start the dialogue, right? And that means often taking a risk, and it doesn't come naturally. create the conditions where you can explore both your own interests, yeah, never mind your position, your own interests. What do you need? What do you need? What does the project need? And also think of what does the other party need? You know, put yourself in their shoes. And in that way, you can then discover common ground and importantly, that common purpose that Mark has been talking about. We would also say, pay particular attention to the financial aspects of a crisis because they're likely to be problematic and particularly contentious, right? So you just can't avoid those issues. This is particularly important when the project risks are not shared and margins are low, right? Start making a joint plan, be prepared to compromise, be prepared to give and take, yeah? And that way, hopefully you can create a win-win. So this sounds ever so simple and easy, and you know all this, but it's very hard to achieve and it's very hard to do. But we need to have courage and we need to have leadership, collaborative leadership to achieve that. But Karen, there's also other measures, right? Maybe early on in a project.
Yeah,
when a project is being considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this creating a win-win, you know, for me, it's how do we share the loss almost? It could be, you know, because if as a result of this crisis, I mean, certainly in the UK, many contractors are on their last legs, frankly, before this anyway. We've had a whole series of bankruptcies and so forth since the oil crash. So you know, this could be the final straw that pushes a lot of people over the edge. And actually, we all need an industry where there is healthy competition and enough diversity in the workforce. And I'm sure, you know, any owner organization is going to want to value that. So it's, you know, I don't know what win-win looks like in this situation, but if only the supply chain gets battered and loses badly, that's not going to be good for anybody in terms of our projects going forward. So yeah, I'll just go on to that a second. I've got another question from
Karen,
Santok.
just before you move on,
sorry.
this thing about win-win, I think it's also win-win in the real crisis is also a bit of a longer term, requires longer term thinking.
Exactly.
Because as an owner, you've built up a good relationship with suppliers. They understand the way you operate. You've shared information. You might have set up, you know, you put all your engineering in the cloud. If they go bankrupt, and then you've got to start all over again, that's not good for you now, and it's not good for you in the future.
No,
so
exactly.
You know, having that longer term view. And the thing about trust, I just wanted to touch on, starts when you start engaging with each other. So something to think about is how, if the trust has fractured or broken, there's a little bit of soul searching to do. How have we shown up? And even from the contracting process, how have we shown up and engaged in response to the crisis? Thinking that through. So it's not always about what they've done to us, but what might have we done? What's our share that could have fractured trust?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ownership. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where, you know, we're actively, Kingsfield's actively involved at the moment in working with a toolkit called the Project Collaboration Toolkit, which has been developed by the ECITB, the Engineering Construction Industry Training Board in the UK, and has been used mostly offshore in the North Sea. And there have been several really good pilot studies, case studies run with major, you know, organizations through the supply chain. And if you're interested in any of them, there's some really good case studies on their website. But what that's looking at and what it's advocating is starting this project collaboration from the very, very earliest stages of a project conception. You know, I mean, we talk about early contractor involvement as a term which is sort of used in the UK as well. This kind of is taking it to a new level because it's advocating that we set up as a team from the beginning. And as bumps happen along the road, then we are just so much more prepared to cope with those bumps, to be more resilient, and to cope with the understandings. The trust hopefully will be there, etc., etc. And those, if you look at those case studies, they're really interesting, because although and I'm an engineer, and I'm coming from this from a hard practical, this is all a bit, could this be a bit woolly and a nice to have? But actually the results from those, apart from the massively improved relationships, is that they saved about between 10 and 30% on the overall capital cost of the job. The projects were brought in on time or ahead of schedule, and bearing in mind they're all very aggressively bid in the first place. And the sizes of the teams, which relates to the cost, of course, are so much smaller, because there is a trust there, and there's no need for man-to-man marking, because everybody is coming together to solve, to work in the joint interests of the job, and thinking about, you talked, Gabrielle and Mark, about putting, this is about putting the project first and the project's needs first, rather than my personal interests. So that kind of, it makes such fantastic business sense, and it's being adopted quite widely in the offshore business at the moment, and we're hoping that it will get looked at sort of more widely. I just have one final question here. Again, I think it's from Santosh, saying that I think collaboration depends on effective stakeholder engagement, which is exactly what the Project Collaboration Toolkit is all about. It also depends on cultural backgrounds, e.g. Americans versus Europeans versus Arabs. And so anything that you could offer or comment on this? Maybe Gabrielle, would you like to say something on this? This is a lot of, you've done a lot of work in this area.
Yeah,
I'm sure you have as well, Mark. Yeah.
Cross-cultural issues, they absolutely, of course, play into any engagement between parties, humans, but I think the quest for collaboration reaches across cultural boundaries. So I don't know whether I think it's such a big issue where we come from, what language we speak, as long as we have a common language to communicate with. I think there is enough human common purpose and ground that can be discovered if we are only brave enough and courageous enough and give us space to do that. I don't know, Mark, what do you think?
I completely agree. There is value in understanding, the cultural differences and nuances of all your partners. That diversity across your project, national as well as corporate. Corporate culture as well plays out. But my experience is sometimes it's overplayed. And if you are really clear around purpose, that it's clear, it's compelling, and that it's consequential, it's something that everybody can rally behind, then a lot of the other differences, the impact of those diminish. I won't say they go away completely, but they do diminish. And I fell into the trap at times of overplaying the cultural differences. And on reflection, what was missing was the alignment, the clarity of purpose, the joint commitment across the project.
No, and I would, from being assigned and having lived in many places in the world and worked on many projects, I would completely echo that as well. And I think it is slightly not to be underestimated, but overplayed. So anyway, we are running out of time. We don't have any more questions. I appreciate this is a slightly different kind of webinar from the ones that we've run before, but we wanted to kind of bring you a different aspect to how we're all trying to think about and deal with this pandemic and the impacts on our projects. And at the end of the day, we always say with all of our training and everything that humans deliver projects. It's not a machine or a process or whatever. And collaborating together is, for me, and as I say, almost every industry body at the moment is advocating to work together to resolve the projects, whatever they are, whether that's keeping them going, restarting them, or new projects. It doesn't really matter where you are in the project cycle, but everybody is absolutely advocating doing that. And we just wanted to offer some thoughts on that. Definitely would appreciate any feedback that you have after the webinar. Please send in any questions, comments, or any topics for future discussions. So I think all that remains is for me to thank Mark very much for your contribution, Mark. It's been really interesting to hear things from your perspective, and also to Gabrielle. So thank you very much. Thank you for all for listening again. We have another webinar. I think John Fotherby is picking up the reins next week, and continuing with some further discussions with one of our legal partners, Freeths. So some very interesting set of debates and discussions going on between John and his colleague at Freeths there. So if you're interested, sign up for some more. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.